Welcome. Today we have as a guest Professor James Kurth, who's becoming somewhat of a regular on this channel. He's the author of The American Way of Empire, How America Won a World but Lost Her Way, available at bookstores everywhere and Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Audible, audiobooks for those of you who like to hear it in your earphones, and Kindle if you don't want a paper book. And Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Swarthmore College, Naval War College, Harvard University, PhD, Stanford University graduate, consultant to the Chief of Naval Operations, many member of the Council of Foreign Relations, many articles, lectures, etc. And currently working on a new book about the rise and fall of civilizations, including Western civilization, our own civilization. And today's episodes on, I guess, a related topic, we got a comment in the comment section on the episode about Henry Kissinger. And Tugboat Captain 4 months ago posted, would like to hear more from Kurth on your channel. I share these videos with him far and wide. I didn't see it right away. I'm sorry for the delay, but I answered back about a month ago, what topics would you like to hear him talk about? And he wrote back, I'd like to hear him talk about the current campus protests about Israel and Gaza. And so I asked Professor Kurth, would he be willing to talk about that? And he said yes. And so today's topic will be the significance of the campus protests about Israel and Gaza. And I may ask some questions relating it to other protests, like civil rights protests, the anti-war protests in the 60s, anti-apartheid protests, and against the Shah, and so forth. So with all that said as introduction, take it away, Professor Kurth.
Thank you very much, Larry. This, of course, is a very lively topic at this very moment. It's alive up on the great lawn in front of the main registration building at my college, Swarthmore College, so much so that the college has moved its commencement for Saturday to a whole nother place, an undisclosed location until recently. And of course, when I say that the protest, tent encampment, of course, was on the great lawn in front of the administration building, other people will recognize from universities close to them that's the same protocol that's happening every place. And in many cases, since the commencements were always held on that great lawn in front of the administration building or in front of the main library, in the library at Columbia, the library at Harvard. Therefore, the commencement has to be moved, and that's an important aspect of these demonstrations. Now, I would like to share my conception of how to think about these demonstrations, how to analyze them, put them in perspective. Indeed, I might say a six-dimensional perspective, a six-sided die through which one can view these demonstrations, sort of walking around them and looking at it from six different sides. Now, several of the sides relate to the actual structure and dynamics, the character and the activities of these demonstrations. And there I want to talk about what might be called the who are the people demonstrating, the ways, the way they're demonstrating, the what is rather the why they say they're demonstrating, and then the when. Why did it occur? When it did. In other words, at the beginning of the very end of the spring semester in many universities. But there are two other dimensions that I want to look at that you've already alluded to. One is the comparative perspective. How does this demonstration compare and contrast with other recent demonstrations, most notably the famous and to some people, notorious demonstrations during the George Floyd summer of 2020. Let it be noted, another general presidential election year. And then also, how does it look? How do they compare historically to earlier demonstrations in American history, and including student demonstrations and the archetypical demonstrations, as you pointed out, on the issue of the war in Vietnam, and of race, that is to say, the situation of the Black population in America, those archetypical demonstrations that set the standard, if you will, of American demonstrations from roughly 1968, beginning, yes, then as now, at Columbia, and then continuing on to 1970, when, of course, they ended abruptly with the shooting at Kent State by the National Guard, and with 4 students being killed. So there are several interesting ways that or perspectives we could look at these demonstrations. I think what I'll begin with, but then I want you to ask questions and make sure that we talk about what you and the viewer who was referring to me asked about. I want to make sure we talk about what's most important to you and him and to others. But let me focus on the who. Just who are these people demonstrating? Now, we live in an age of so-called identity politics, and people's identity is determined by what race and what gender they were born into, like critical race theory and critical gender theory. So it's identitarian politics. And so we are supposed to think about people in terms of their race and gender, or more generically, let's say, ethnic identity and various forms of expressing their gender identity. But the interesting thing is, virtually all accounts of these demonstrations, those that are sympathetic, like in the mainstream media, those that are critical, like in more conservative media, those in very intelligent journals, such as The Atlantic and The New Yorker, in terms of the left center, and those who are very concerned about this threat to Israel and to Jews in particular, such as the very wise and informed Jewish magazines, Mosaic and Tablet. It's interesting, the one thing these all have in common is you never hear about the specific identities, that is to say, ethnic or gender of the demonstrators. It's all kind of a generic view. The image you get is there's a kind of a fresh-faced student, earnest, and demonstrating on this issue of great moral concern to them, but we don't have any idea about what particular identity they're coming from. So that I have found curious. Now, I've gathered information not only from my own college, but from much more, or at least much larger places, such as universities, such as Harvard and Penn and Columbia and Stanford and UCLA and Northwestern, etc. And I've gathered the following kind of observations, people actually observing the demonstrators and looking at them to see who they are in terms of ethnicity and gender. And this is the conclusion I've come up with. So in a normal demonstration, a typical one, including at the schools that I've just mentioned, of the student demonstrators who are actually students at the university, the actual students who are out there demonstrating, who are in the tent encampments, for example, these will be normally about 60 to 70%. 60 to 70% of the students will be from, obviously, first at the smallest and most intense level, Palestinian background. Either they're from Palestine themselves, or their parents are, and often they're coming from communities where there are Palestinians. More broadly, they will come from Arab backgrounds, and most broadly, they come from Muslim backgrounds, especially non-Arab Muslim states such as Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey. So roughly 60 to 70% of the students demonstrating, and also often the major spokesperson for the demonstration, is coming from that background, at its broadest, a Muslim country background. That means either by coming from that country themselves, or by growing up in a community where their parents and friends and relatives of their parents, they're coming from a community for which the whole issue, not just of Gaza, I'll talk about that more in terms of the kind of why, but more broadly, Israel, and even more broadly, Jews, is very important. If you're growing up in those communities, you grow up in an atmosphere of being very hostile to Israel, and sometimes that spills over to hostility to Jews as Jews. Well, it's not surprising if you have a lot of students from those backgrounds on campuses that they will protest on these very issues when the opportunity and the organization and resources behind it come together. So that's a big group. What it means is, what it means is that there's nothing really unusual about this. In earlier day, when Black students, such as in the late 60s, early 70s, when Black students on campus, when the issue came up more generally in this or that incident, like the assassination of Martin Luther King in early 68, when issues came up that were important to the students' identity, to the community they come from, they felt a moral responsibility to protest. This is a very old pattern in America. And so there's no surprise that these most broadly Muslim students, especially Arab students, and within that especially Palestinian students, are protesting. So that's one example. But of course, I only said it was about 60 or 70%. There are other students that are also participating. It turns out they're all, virtually all, coming from what is called the kind of Intersectionality Alliance. The Intersectionality Alliance, often known as the Woke Alliance, these are the people who believe that they are members of particular groups, intersections of different a kind of exploitations and oppressions from dominant groups. And of course, the Intersectionality Alliance is composed first of people who are described in critical race theory, essentially as this particular parade of letters, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And then there, of course, is that described in the gender critical theory, and that is LGBTQ, etc. Now, in these demonstrations, maybe about 10, 20% of the people who are demonstrating will be from those groups. And they are demonstrating on behalf of one big group in the Intersectionality Coalition, and that is Palestinians. This is a common practice around the world, especially organized in Scandinavia. Around the world, when one group in the Intersectionality Alliance is making a public demonstration, like maybe outside the embassy of some country that seems, they say, is repressing somebody represented in the alliance. So, for example, I was in Reykjavik, Iceland, of all places, and there was a big demonstration outside the American embassy on behalf of Hispanics who were being brutalized at the border, according to the demonstration. Well, the reason for that wasn't that there are lots of Hispanics in Iceland, or that Iceland especially had a very important foreign policy vis-a-vis Hispanics. No, the reason was because on that very day, around the Scandinavian countries, or more broadly Nordic countries, there were similar demonstrations. It's a kind of international solidarity mode of operating. So of course, if one member of the coalition is demonstrating on its issue, the Palestinians, then the others have to go there. not everybody, but certainly their leaders. And so that's why you get at these demonstrations what otherwise seem to be very bizarre signs, such as a sign and a person saying queers for Palestine or trans for Palestine. Doesn't mean that all the queers or trans or anybody else, the other people in the LGBTQ are there, but they have to send a representative to show solidarity. So that's another big group of people there. Then there's a very small group of people, students, who actually fit the image that would normally be evoked in the description, or dare I say, non-descriptions of the media, be it mainstream, center left, or more less mainstream, center right or right, which don't identify that. The image you get is some kind of typical, a phrase they often use on campuses, basic white person, just a basic white person. And so there will be some basic white people there who want to demonstrate allyship with the Intersectionality Alliance, and more specifically with the particular oppressed group. Just like the Swarthmore students up there, Swarthmore Students for Justice for Palestine, that sign behind you, that included some of those people. But the bulk of the demonstrators at Swarthmore were all people who were at some point had a personal or family connection with a Muslim country. So that's pretty much the composition of the demonstrators. This is not the demonstrators of students in general. It's students who are protesting, especially those from the Muslim countries, protesting something that there were prototypes of that in the past. And there were times when, of course, Irish students protested. That was before when Black students protested. It goes back. And so that's not much of a surprise about this. Once you have a group of students who come from a particular ethnic group that are experiencing discrimination or oppression either in this country or in their home country, it's very likely that if some big dramatic incident or cluster of incidents occur, then they will start demonstrating on the campus. So that pretty much describes the who of who's demonstrating, which I think gives us a more granular picture, a structure to the who than we're normally getting from the media. But I'll pause now, and then you can ask questions on that or anything else.
You said it was a six-sided die. I count three: identity, intersectionality alliance, ordinary student, allyship. Do you want to do 4, 5, and 6 now?
The 6 sides of the who is only one of the sides. I'll eventually get shortly to the ways and to the whys and to the whens. And then the comparative and the historical analogies. So no, there are not 6 different whos. There are roughly 3 categories of whos.
Okay. Well, about these whos, before we go on, you said 60% were Palestinian, Arab, or Muslim students. 10 to 20% are BIPOC and LGBTQ, etc. Does that mean the other 10 to 20% are ordinary students in allyship? Or we read a lot about outside agitators, not to sound like George Wallace, but what percentage of people are from outside the student?
Well, you see, I'm going to get to that.
And what percent are faculty and administrators?
Well, that's right. I was focusing on the students when I was describing this. In the back of my mind, I was going to go to the outside people. And depending on the college, roughly 20 to 30% are outside people, but only a few of them will be students from other universities. So I'll get to those outside people because they become very important when we turn to the next topic on my list, and that's the ways. But getting back to where we were, in terms of the actual students, as I say, the numbers will vary from one place to another. There are particular universities that have a very large number of students from Muslim countries, and then there are others who have a smaller. Particularly prominent in having a large number of students from Muslim countries would be Columbia, Penn, Northwestern, and UCLA. Less so Harvard, but still very significant. Now, in addition, all of these schools will have, as you were pointing out, faculty, quite a few people on the junior faculty who are teaching in the various kinds of centers for Middle East studies or a center on kind of settler colonialism and things like that. So you will have faculty also coming from these backgrounds that will join the students. In addition, you even have administrators, like in the DEI bureaucracy. They'll be joining the demonstrators, especially if they're from these backgrounds or they are participating in the name of the Intersectionality Coalition.
One group you didn't mention, which I'm very concerned with personally, is Jewish supporters of this cause. I know people, indeed sad to say, in my own family, who support the Hamas efforts.
Well, now you're getting into exactly what I had as a subgroup within the basic white person. You see, Jews as Jews are not part of the Intersectionality Coalition. And Jews who are supporters of Israel are therefore the adversary of the Palestinian part of the coalition. But there are, in fact, Jewish students and faculty, administrators who actually support the Students for Justice in Palestine, to look at the back behind you. So what about those people? By the definition of the intersectionality, degrees of suppression and suppressed, Jews are not part of the suppressed. They are part of the suppressors. But many Jews arrive on campus who want to be, and so there was a recent collection of interviews in Tablet of various Jewish students around the country at universities. Quite a few of them said they had come to their university wanting to fight for social justice. And their friends initially were part of the Intersectionality Coalition, even though they are not officially part. They're part of the allyship. They're part of the allyship. They want to demonstrate allyship with their fellow social justice warriors. The problem was, once the October 7th Hamas attack occurred, and then later the IDF actions in Gaza, all of a sudden their friends turned into their enemies. And it at best shunned them and from time to time berated them. And so they're in great distress and great agony. In other words, amongst the basic white people are the people who are Jewish, but who come from backgrounds in America that are extremely progressive. Their parents were in favor of, their parents would have been progressives by identity and favor of social justice. Now some of their older siblings are woke and in favor of social justice. So in a curious way, they're representing their own, dare I say, ethnic background, but it makes for a very strange contradiction and great poignancy, because it turns out what they thought had been their best friends now are turning out to be adversaries who are making life extremely difficult at their universities. Now, this group of people who are very much progressive, social justice, joined the coalition, but are now in great difficulty. They come from a particular background within the overall Jewish community. That is generally, has been for many decades, hostile to Israel. In other words, a progressive, and especially a woke person who is Jewish, is actually hostile to Israel. And an excellent example of this kind of person, the leading intellectual spokesperson for this point of view, is Peter Beinart. Peter Beinart, and he leads a group of people. He's editor of a journal called Jewish Currents, and they criticize again and again in the journal, in lectures, and podcasts, Israel as an ethno-nationalist state, or Israel as an ethno-religious state. They are carrying the universalist tradition of Judaism to its ultimate conclusion, so much it excludes any particularist tradition. So often the people we're talking about, the students, come from that background. They believe they have a better way to be Jewish, better way to be Jewish. And as a matter of fact, of course, in quite a few places, universities, especially out in California, there are a group called Jewish Students for Peace. Jewish Students for Peace. That's right.
Let's just talk a little bit more about that because we talked about some of these organizations are actually headed by middle-aged Jewish people, not just young, naive students that are organizing these demonstrations. And some of the funders, most famously Soros and his son Alex Soros, are funding these organizations. So that, in other words, this isn't just some poor kid who doesn't know any better. These are actually people who know exactly what they're doing. And what do you think their role is in all of this? In addition, you have senators like Bernie Sanders who apparently defend this sort of thing, even though Hamas is listed as a terrorist organization since 1997 in the Clinton administration because it sponsors terror against Americans. And also one of its slogans, in addition to death to Israel, is death to America. So basically, if you're endorsing a Hamas demonstration, you're endorsing not only death to Israel, but death to America. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I think I'll partition your question into two parts. You mentioned that a lot of these people who are heading up these organizations or funding these organizations, that is to say, the organizations that are engaged in demonstrations certain place or participating in the current student demonstrations, the people who are heading those up are older, and the funders are obviously older and richer. But of course, this phenomenon has existed a long time. That is to say, there has been, since the foundation of the state of Israel, a group of people who thought that it was illegitimate because it wasn't a binational state. That is to say, it emphasized the particularist Jewish identity and excluded the Palestinian identity, and they criticized that. That wasn't a very large group in 1948, but it got much larger after 1967, when Israel therefore expanded in the Six-Day War and took some authority over areas that had hitherto been in Jordan and had a very large Palestinian population, obviously Judea and Samaria and Gaza and, yes, East Jerusalem. So now all of a sudden there was the whole issue of the way that Israel treated Palestinians under their authority became a big issue, and therefore that caused many people, especially since this was occurring in the late 60s, when young progressive Jews entering into college at this very point. There was lots of protests going at that time, like the Vietnam War and racism against blacks. But that is a time they became very politically conscious, and therefore they also, the particular group I'm referring to, separated themselves from identity with Israel and became critical. The next thing that caused a problem was in 1977, when Likud, the right-center party in Israel, under Begin, his successor Shamir, and his successor Netanyahu, but all of them finding their lineage back with Jabotinsky, the revisionist, as they were called, in Central Europe in the late 30s. That conservative party, a much more Israeli particularist party, took power for the first time, where the Labor Party, which had ruled in Israel ever since 1948 all the way through 1977, they could always be seen, and actually often were, not being right-wing, but being progressive in one way or another. Some Labor Party people were socialist, some were social democrats, some were liberals, but the left in America, who were associated with the Democratic Party, initially defined themselves as liberal, later progressives, now woke. The left back in the original time of Israel, 48 to 67, the left could always say, well, the party in Israel is a party of the left, so we can work out things with them. Once it turned out the Labor Party had the problem of how to deal with the Palestinians, and was sometimes rather rough, that caused some heartburn. But what was especially dividing was when Likud came in, and more or less has been the most dominant party in Israel ever since then, with the Labor Party occasionally running the cabinet, but getting weaker and weaker. So what this means is the people who are always inclined to put their emphasis on Judaism defined as progressive, universalist, social justice. That was a definition, one way of being Jewish. Those people have had in their own minds, in successive generations, more and more grounding for that. So that means there is a long-standing network of political leaders representing that, like Bernie Sanders. I don't think he's ever said a good word about Israel. He really entered into politics just about the time we're talking about, as a mayor of Burlington, Vermont. He entered into politics in the late 60s, early 70s. So there have been political leaders of that sort. But in addition, there have been funders. Most obviously, notoriously, George Soros funds a whole array of groups who are critical of Israel, and amongst many other progressive groups. So I think that may put this in perspective. Is there any puzzle you still have after that?
No, I think that was very, very helpful. Now let's talk about the other sides of the die, if we can.
Very important, and often conflated in the media accounts are the ways. And they will correlate to the different groups. And at this point, I'm going to introduce the off-campus, even professional activists that come on campus and join the students. So here are three basic ways in which the people demonstrate. The first way, and it's perfectly embodied by the tent encampments that started in April with Columbia and spread very rapidly. But even during the fall and winter, there were in various schools, there were these sit-ins, or maybe marches up and down the campus, or maybe flashing signs on the walls of particular buildings. These were, so to speak, mostly peaceful protests. They were not aggressive civil disobedience. And with the tent encampments, they're really quite passive, the civil disobedience. So they're mostly peaceful, and they are civil disobedience, but what's harmful about a tent encampment? That is one way of doing it. Now, students of all sorts that I described, they see no reason why a student shouldn't be able to participate in that. After all, even the Supreme Court has said that kind of demonstration is free speech. And of course, the universities are always saying, oh, we have all sorts of free speech and debate. And so these students have something that doesn't seem to cause any heartburn because they're engaging in civil disobedience. But who are the civilian authorities? These pompous bureaucrats who are saying you shouldn't be there, and you shouldn't be there because we want to have our campus, our commencement there in a couple of weeks. So that's one way of doing it. And of course, media that are very supportive of the students always emphasize that. the mostly peaceful demonstrations. Now, there's a second escalation of this. And that is, well, actually, before I escalate, let me say that. Now, although these are mostly peaceful, that doesn't mean they're all a bunch of moral students just sort of spontaneously coming together. After all, how did it happen that very quickly you had in 50 different universities tent encampments? Where did all those tents come from? And when they were set up, then you had to have a continuing flow of supplies. That took organization, and not just organization on a particular campus like Columbia, but to spread it to other campuses. And it took organization to sustain these by bringing in food and water. Oh, yes. And recently, been an emphasis on the so-called potty tents. In other words, there had to be a kind of little toilet tent. And all this took very systematic organization. And it was planned beforehand. And so, and the organizations doing this are the ones you've just mentioned. Okay. Now, in these organized tent encampments, when people come in, including other students and maybe reporters from student newspapers, when they come into these encampments, it turns out it's highly organized. This has been reported from Columbia's encampment by 3 or 4 different people that have appeared in the media, including Peggy Noonan in the Wall Street Journal. And that is, they try to ask questions of the students, but the students are not allowed by the organizers to answer questions of journalists. The student is supposed to say, "I'm not trained." That's right. They have to be, the only ones who can speak are those who have been trained to speak and speak the right way. So, "I'm not trained. You have to go to that tent." So you go to a tent that's the press tent, the tent for the press, and then you get the official full line, etc. And if you want to walk around the encampment, then you have an escort, a minder, you might say. So even in the mostly peaceful doesn't mean it's spontaneous or naive, quite the contrary. So that's the first way. Now, from time to time, outside activists come, often to give advice to the inside activists, the organizers, of how it's been done other places and how you want to do it this time. That's just the beginning of the outside activists. Now, the next thing that comes is the actual demonstration that physically obstructs the movement of people on the universities, such as the movement across campus, movement inside buildings, and physically obstruct. This is aggressive civil disobedience. You're disrupting the normal life of people. Whereas a tent encampment up on the lawn only disrupts a potential, event like the commencement. But when you are actually occupying and setting in administration buildings or in libraries and marching up and down shouting in libraries, well, this is getting to be aggressive. At this particular point, the more radical, the more organized of the students, the more committed of the students, then they are the ones who are doing that. But most important, the proportion of participants from outside, professional activists, long experienced activists, not students at all, maybe older than students, begins to increase. Then comes the third stage. These demonstrations in which you're disrupting the flow of traffic doesn't only occur on campuses. Most importantly, in the course of the fall and the winter, were the demonstrations that blocked major highways, thoroughfares, such as freeways in Los Angeles, such as roads to airports, like in Chicago and Atlanta and other places like that, tunnels, such as the tunnels into Manhattan. Disrupting those, that is major, active, aggressive civil disobedience. We're going to see more of that between now and the election, and then in the election to the certification, and then the certification to the inauguration. So that's the next great step. finally comes the actual, no longer civil disobedience, out and out violent assault against property, breaking actual laws, criminal laws. And that is when you begin to, when you break into buildings like Hamilton Hall. That was the escalation in Columbia recently, just like it had been at Hamilton Hall back in 1968. You break into a building that's been locked. You then barricade it. You take desks and chairs and big other things. You barricade it. You put chains across it, etc. This is actually damaging property and breaking the law, is breaking and entering, and keeping people out. And then, so that is the next escalation. There, the proportion of people who are experienced, trained, outside activists is very high. There will always be some students, the more radical students, already months before October 7th, already committed. These people are not necessarily focusing on Palestinian issues or Israeli issues. They simply see that as something for their ultimate objective, which is essentially nihilist, to burn the system down. And of course, they are best represented in our time by Antifa, which is a self-conscious anarchic organization, and they're identified with their black bloc tactics, black bloc. In other words, Antifa people, and this happened at Columbia at the time of the Hamilton Hall takeover, they will all be wearing black. That makes it very difficult to identify them. They'll all be wearing masks. And so that's, you see in essence, people who want to tear the system down. These are highly organized, and often they go from one city to another, depending on the circumstances of where they can deploy. And of course, they're very active in universities, which are especially in large cities where a large number of these people live, such as in Philadelphia and in New York and even in Boston.
All right. Are those the 6 sides of the die?
No, that's just 2 aspects of the first. That's 2 sides. That's 2 sides.
Okay,
Then,
let's go on.
Okay, the next one is the why. Why are they doing this, or why do they say it? Well, there's an interesting non-event here. Of course, if we actually look what's happening to Palestinians now, that would presumably get Palestinians and beyond them Arabs and beyond them Muslims very angry. It would be the actual actions of the IDF in Palestine, and which is causing pain and suffering, either through actual firepower or through deprivation of food, water, medical supplies, etc. You would look at the actual suffering of the Palestinians. But what's fascinating is that's not the emphasis of the protest. The protest emphasis is to be anti-Zionist, anti-Israel. Well, of course, you could say it's Israel that's oppressing the Palestinians. But if you really were concerned about the humanitarian pain and suffering of the Palestinians, you would focus on that. And then you would essentially say, what's causing that? That students or activists in America can stop. It's not that anything they do is going to stop the action of the IDF directly or change the mind of people in Israel. What they would do, they would be saying to the Biden administration, stop providing arms that provide the firepower for all this pain and suffering. But they don't do that. No, what they do is they say, divest from anything Israeli. It's a carrying on of the BDS movement, because that's what the universities can do. In other words, they're not protesting the Biden administration directly or even indirectly. They're protesting their university's policy. But of course, the university does nothing to enable the IDF to kill people. So they're protesting it in the old-fashioned BDS way. So that's an interesting non-event. They want to say they're representing the pain and suffering of the Palestinian people, But actually, what they're doing is essentially maniacally focused on the destruction of Israel. And that's why the most important slogan is, of course, from the river to the sea, let Palestine be free. They're not saying from the Mediterranean to Gaza, let's bring food and water and medical supplies to the Gazans. So I'll leave our listeners to decide how authentic and sincere the concern of these demonstrators is for the Gazans, as opposed to their hatred and loathing of Israel. Now, of course, once they start talking about Zionists, then often coming from communities that as they were growing up, they learned that a Zionist was a Jew and a Jew was a Zionist. Therefore, this very quickly spreads to becoming not just anti-Zionist, but anti-Jewish as Jews. And so this is a rather, Jews in America, how does that affect the pain and suffering of Palestinians in Gaza?
I don't think I can answer that question, but let's keep going through the six-sided die because I'd like to get through with it as soon as we can.
So the last of the four kind of commentary on the structure and dynamics, the kind of character and the actions of the demonstrations. The last is the when. Well, there's no particular mystery about why the demonstrators began almost immediately after the Hamas attack of October 7th. That's fairly obvious. But what's kind of intriguing is why, at a certain time, many more demonstrations occurred, in other words, beginning in April, and continued. And of course, now they're running down because the students are running out of the campuses. It'll be very quiet for the next month or two until maybe summer school students come back or whatever. Certainly activated in the fall again. But so a whole quantum leap took place in April, and a qualitative leap. In other words, a whole new method, the tent encampments. And so what explains why that happened? Well, one of the oldest lessons that university administrators learned about student protests, this was certainly learned within a year or two of the protest in the late 60s. And it was learned by earlier administrations trying to put down protests, like Protestant students at a couple of the universities in Germany in 1517, when Martin Luther started the Reformation. It goes all the way back to universities in the Middle Ages, Oxford and Bologna and the Sorbonne. Students, when they want to protest, almost always protest as winter becomes spring. And so the springtime protest is an ancient tradition. That's when the Columbian protests began in April of 1968. It then spread to many places in many universities, including Harvard and Stanford and Swarthmore, that I have had some connection with in April and May. So the springtime protest is something that comes naturally to students, their psychology, their physiology. So that's one thing. And therefore, administrators have known for almost a millennium, or at least since the high Middle Ages with the universities, that if you wait long enough, spring turns into summer and students leave the university and go home. And so the protests will wither away. Over the summer, you take action to either preempt or put down the next time a demonstration occurs in the fall. But if you're in a northern campus, pretty soon fall becomes winter, and then you have climate working on your side again. So that's one reason why this particular demonstration occurred when it did. There was another reason, And that's why it began in Colombia. Well, the people who are learned in protest, who were around during the archetypical protests, the heroic age of protest in 68 to 70, such as myself, they all knew it started with Colombia. Now, once it started with Colombia, then it spread, but it took a year to spread until the next spring. But this time it started at Colombia. That was deliberate to start at Colombia, and started in exactly the same place, the great lawn in front of the library, and then eventually escalate to another building nearby Hamilton. This particular demonstration was designed to essentially mirror a kind of second coming, if you will, of the Columbia way of demonstration of 1968. In addition, the demonstrators are always trying to get the media to give them coverage, normally with, of course, left-center media, liberal one time, later progressive, now woke. They will get favorable coverage, but any coverage. And they knew that in mid-April that the president of Colombia would be giving testimony before a congressional committee. They knew the media would be looking at that. The whole media world would be watching her testimony because, of course, that had become a big story in the fall with the Harvard president testimony and the Penn testimony. So they were hoping the media were hoping here's going to be a good story. So they were watching what's happening at the Columbia. The very day that she gave her testimony, right after that, that's when the tent encampments went up, because they knew the media would be covering anything that happened at Columbia. So there was the whole particular timing in general in April. In particular, it actually happened to be on the very week of April that it occurred in 68. As it happened again in 2024, the very timing in terms of the anniversary of Columbia, that'd be another thing why people would be talking about it. And then the actual testimony of the president. It's all highly choreographed, symbolic, but it's part of a very new story. That is to say, presidents being grilled by congressional committees. That's a pretty new story. It's a very old story. The springtime protest is at least 800 years old.
Okay. Do we have any more sides of the die? Because I only count 4, but you said there were going to be 6.
Well, there is the comparisons with recent demonstrations on completely different issues. And then there's the more historical one, which I've already alluded to, comparisons with American demonstrations of an earlier but now recurrent era. Now, of course, the most obvious prototype of the current student demonstrations, the last thing on that scale was the famous George Floyd demonstrations of the summer of 2022. Now, students had virtually nothing to do with those demonstrations, even when they came back from campus. They came back to campus in the fall. And of course, Palestine and Israel had nothing to do with those demonstrations. But you do notice certain techniques. Here was a classical way that the George Floyd protest worked themselves out, not on university campuses, but in big cities. And by the weekend after George Floyd was killed on Memorial Day, Monday, June 25th, then of 2020, with the weekend after that and most weekends thereafter, this is what happened. Black Lives Matter would call a kind of popular demonstration against police brutality, and beyond that, racist city or state governments. They would call that protest in front of a major kind of symbolic building either the state capitol or the city hall, or maybe in Philadelphia, the art museum, the famous, steps, Rocky running up the steps of the art museum. They would call a big popular demonstration to protest racist governments and police brutality at this place. And then they would give speeches. And these were, in fact, mostly peaceful. Then, when the speeches were over in earlier mid-afternoon, then they would start a march down to the different building, down a major thoroughfare, and then they'd come to another building. Often that other building had something to do with the criminal justice system. Either it would be a municipal courthouse, or maybe a county courthouse, or it might be a police headquarters. And then they would all surround that and be protesting, yelling against it. The tone was getting a bit more aggressive, insulting. Of course, the police had then surrounded the building, so they were the defending thing, but a thin blue line. But then the demonstrators would begin to get closer and closer to the police. Now dusk is beginning to fall. And at that point, these Black Lives Matter demonstrators and other people joining them, another form of allyship, a lot of earnest white people who were very concerned about police brutality. What began to happen is, although they were just shouting, slogans at the police, what would become up a group of people who had a more aggressive tone, and they'd come up to the front, and then they'd start pushing and shoving against the police. They would escalate the violence. And then all of a sudden, a Molotov cocktail flew into one of the windows of the building, and then another window of the building, etc. In other words, those people were not themselves Black Lives Matter. They were normally who had organized other people coming along just for the excitement. These people were Antifa, and they had also organized people, sometimes the kind of street people, people who are often engaged in streetcar and inclined to be violent. They came along, and so then they had escalated the violence. And of course, the police had to respond. At the same time, in this protocol that occurred in one place after another, a group broke off, led by the more violent people, and then would run down to a nearby major commercial street. And then they would start throwing stones through the windows of and then eventually maybe a Molotov cocktail, but they came along with kind of devices, very strong metal devices that could pry the barriers, the window guards or the door guards. So they just like what happens, of course, at these university buildings when these people get active. So they broke that open. Then they went in and started looting and invited street people coming along and said, come on in, come on and take it. So you see, that was the pattern. As you move from noon to dusk to night, you moved progressively more violent, and the whole thing, the dynamic was taken over, not just from the earnest seeking justice, Black Lives Matter, to an out and out revolutionary anarchist group that wanted to have destruction for its own sake and demonstrate police incompetence and inability to provide security. So that was the dynamic of that. Now you can see some parallels already here. Now we haven't got the firebombing yet. I think that will come. It won't come on the campuses, I think, but as we get closer and closer to the election in November, if Biden, it looks like he might lose to Trump, then you're going to have the demonstrations coming out, against this or that in the big cities. And I think some of those will escalate to what you had back there in the summer. And incidentally, a city that from the state that I grew up in, Oregon, Portland, it had 100 days, one day after another in 2020 and later. It had 100 days of this protocol being worked over every day.
Okay,
So
so we
that's a
have
comparison.
one side of the die left.
Well, let me just mention two other things that happened prior to 2020, showing this is a kind of international pattern or international protocol. You probably have forgotten the so-called Yellow Vest protest in France in the fall of 2019. The Yellow Vests were nothing like the people I'm talking about. These were kind of working class people, small business people in the provinces who were protesting a hike in gas prices, et cetera, making things difficult. And so they were protesting that. But they would be joined in their protest in Paris and other cities at the same time as you move from afternoon to dusk. They were joined by out and out anarchists. And the anarchists actually vandalized, put graffiti all over, paint, major monuments of France. The Arc de Triomphe, for example, was vandalized. A kind of symbol of the Republic was smashed. Her head was cut off and things like that. To say nothing of smashing the windows of shops along the Champs-Élysées. So that was a pattern. This anarchist pattern is a very universal pattern. Same thing that very fall was happening in Chile. When the protests were against a kind of conservative economic, the conservative government and its conservative economic measures. Protests started. There'd be peaceful protests during the day. Then near dusk, the anarchists would come in, and then they started burning churches and dragging statues of Jesus and Mary out and decapitating them or otherwise desecrating them. So this whole pattern began in our own time in Athens, where especially with the 2008-2009 European financial crisis that hit Greeks especially hard. So there were protests against what the EU demand and the IMF and the European Central Bank demanded austerity measures of the Greeks. There were protests, and then always there would be a particular kind of autonomous zone near the major buildings in Athens. That is, say, the Parliament building, a number of other major public buildings, and a square. Near that, there was an autonomous zone where the Greek government had allowed anarchists to live and do their own thing. There are quite a few of those scattered around Europe. And anyway, then the anarchists would come out of the autonomous zone, join the demonstrators that had started in front of the Parliament and were in the main square, march through and throw firebombs into banks. Sometimes people died because of that. So that is a common pattern. And I think that we're seeing a university version of that this time. But in some ways, some of the people who I think will become active in the fall against Trump and his voters, and will try to take the election to the streets one way or the other. Some of those people are seeing this as a kind of dry run for the protest here, and include the violent aspects and the cutting off of traffic arteries. You see, that's a very good thing to do for effectiveness of showing how much power you really have and how powerless the state security forces are. So I think there's some interesting comparisons if we look geographically. The original way this started was when Antifa was actually founded, believe it or not, back in the last years of the Weimar Republic in Germany. In other words, Antifa was founded there. Remember, it means anti-fascist. It was anti-Nazi. And they got into street demonstrations, street battles with the Nazis, and also escalated to this kind of violence. It's been around for a long time. Now, the last comparison is the historical one, and that was the comparison with the heroic age of American protests, and that were the student protests of 68 to 70. And as I already indicated, they began, at least on the East Coast of Columbia, Those of you who are from California, of course, knew they really began at Berkeley in '64, but it took a while to migrate back east. But it began at Columbia and along the lines I'm talking about. And then the protests ended when the National Guard killed 4 students. I happen to know that was actually decisive because at that time, I was at Harvard as a young assistant professor, and I saw the whole thing working out from all dimensions. And I attended a major meeting in the fall of 1970. Kent State had been in the May of 1970, and this was in September 1970 on the eve of the beginning of the academic year. This is a meeting of activists up and down the East Coast, and they were meeting at Harvard to decide what comes next. And they were saying, we can't get students to participate in the demonstrations anymore. That has suddenly changed with what Napoleon would have called the whiff of grape shot of the National Guard killing those students at Kent State. The steam went out of the demonstrations when the bullets went into the bodies of those people at Kent State. Now, I myself, the equivalent of Antifa then were the so-called weathermen, later the weather underground. Now, it happened that I, in a Center for International Affairs, which had the offices prior to him becoming a national security advisor for President Nixon in January '69. Prior to that, his major office was in the Center for International Affairs. Also, an office there was for Samuel Huntington, who was my thesis advisor. These were seen as war criminals by student demonstrators, including the mostly peaceful one at Harvard. But of course, Kissinger was safely in Washington. Huntington was chairman of the government department there. Anyway, I and several others, young assistant professors involved in international affairs, were having lunch in September 1969. And all of a sudden, we heard some shouting the floor below, and we're bursting in were these weathermen who were essentially beating up people, kicking them down the stairs. I was kicked down the stairs, taking them out, throwing them up against a car, karate chop in the back of their head. That happened to me. So I was actually attacked by the Antifa of the day. Much more dramatic than anything I think has happened thus far. I'm just looking forward to it happening again. Bring back the good old days. Ultimately, of course, I testified with the leader. His name was Eric Mann. He was from Cornell. He was a Cornell student, but he really wasn't a student. He was a professional activist. And he went on years later to actually train 2 of the top leaders of Black Lives Matter. You see, the more things change, the more they remain the same.
Well, that is an incredible story to end on. You didn't mention the word communist in this whole discussion, but I do believe the Communist Party was involved with the Weathermen at the time and is involved with Black Lives Matter today. And actually, Black Lives Matter, you said the students had nothing to do with that. A lot of professors and teachers took their students or gave them extra credit for being in demonstrations. And Black Lives Matter officially supported the Palestinians and was officially anti-Zionist. They had to take it off their website. And of course, after the massacre, Black Lives Matter endorsed Hamas again. So I think there is a connection between the organizations.
Well,
both
I
historical,
won't contest that.
both
Everything
historical.
you say is true. Everything you say is true. It's just that I had looming large in my mind that since George Floyd was killed on Memorial Day, and by that time, most students had left campuses, the summer of George Floyd was not a summer where students were participating, but when they got back, they did, or even when they went home, when in their home city, there would be some Black Lives Matter demonstrations, like shutting down a highway. That was very common in many cities. They'd show up for that. That's right.
And plenty of these Antifa activists, when they were arrested, their occupation was teacher or assistant professor, lecturer, or they were some types of campus employee. So, I mean, the unfortunate educational field is not the non-violent contemplation of the good, unfortunately. Let me just raise 2 other points. It was absolutely fascinating what you just said. You also had 2 more personal experiences. One, you were actually involved in stopping the Khashoggi Center. Adnan Khashoggi was an Arab arms dealer at Swarthmore College when you were there. And so you've actually been on a pro-Israel protest against a pro-Palestinian arms dealer. This is the father of the man who was killed by the Saudis. That was totally nonviolent yet very successful. So you would know when you say you think things are insincere, that if you really wanted to have an effect on campus, you can do it without all of these shenanigans.
Well, definitely so. In organizing the resistance, a successful resistance to a plan that Swarthmore College, joining the two other Quaker colleges, Bryn Mawr and Haverford College, to jointly fund or jointly receive a professor of Islamic studies. And that was Adnan Khashoggi, an arms dealer, of course, at Saudi Arabia, the father of the person who, of course, was cut up in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul more later. But that protest was effective, but it did require organization. And I worked closely with pro-Israeli groups and then worked out the organization. And it was a matter of what I called total envelopment of the administration, of the adversary. In other words, the administration of Swarthmore College wanted this program and joining Haverford and Bryn Mawr. And so I had a pattern of total envelopment. And that was this. First, I had students who were the writers or editors of the student newspaper, the so-called Phoenix. And I had them write articles or invite articles critical of this or questioning this. And then I encouraged the editor to write editorials against that. Then that in turn got the attention of the Philadelphia press, like the Philadelphia Inquirer. So then stories began to fill in the Philadelphia Inquirer. So that was that particular thing. Then I had certain students who were inclined, Swarthmore students would normally be against the military-industrial complex and arms things. And so I had those groups begin to make protests. So you had the student paper, and that was amplified in the Philadelphia papers, and even I think on the TV media. And then you had students who had a special interest, not necessarily opposing Islam, but a special interest in the arms issue. And then that was magnified that other groups like the American Friends Service Committee, they didn't like that. So they also had a Quaker connection. So the basic idea was that the administration had the feeling, here was a fire they had to put down. Then suddenly there was another fire. And then suddenly there was another fire and another fire. Total envelopment, total envelopment.
Well, thank you. That was a great success. Also, the irony of Quaker College soliciting money from an international arms dealer is actually not that unusual, because I was in Berkeley recently. I didn't go on campus because I didn't want to see the demonstrations. It was interesting. Around the campus, these very liberal Berkeleyites, I saw walking all over Berkeley on the north side, maybe 3 signs in favor of the demonstration, one of which was on the Quaker Meeting House for Free Palestine. So it's like the commitment to nonviolence seems to be somewhat insincere, I would say. Let's go one more thing. The most famous Swarthmore protest that I know of happened right before I got there, and I didn't know about it when I applied. It was a civil rights protest that led to the death of the Swarthmore president, Courtney Smith. None of the people involved were ever prosecuted. All went on, there's actually a book about it, to great careers, very successful government, nonprofit sector business. Courtney Smith had, of course, been very sympathetic. I read a biography of him. He was devoted to civil rights his whole life, progressive. He was kept prisoner, kidnapped essentially, had a heart attack and died. Would you say that model of Courtney Smith as the suicidal progressive is what's animating sympathy of administrators and faculty for what's going on right now?
I think in general, that is the case. That is to say, as I already implied, a sequence that liberalism as the particular ideology at a time and place of the left of the day, liberalism was succeeded. Well, liberalism was the left idea of the greatest generation and of the silent generation. The baby boomer generation coming of age and student age in the late 60s, they considered liberalism old and tired. That was the old left. They were the new left. They saw themselves as progressives. So that was characteristic of the baby boomer generation and the next generation, Generation X. Then the next generations, the millennial and Generation Z, they saw that new left now to be the progressives, to be the old new left, as opposed to the old left, the liberals. And they saw themselves as the new left. That is essentially woke or social justice or intersectionality. And so there are successive generations. Now, it is always the case that if a generation sees itself as ideologically committed, I've been using on the left, but in Germany, in the first third of the 20th century, it was on the right, and I'll get to that in more detail in a second. But if they see themselves as being on the left, and they believe in it, they teach it to their children, they teach it to their students, you know, the left vision of what the world is and what it should be, and suppose that they were liberals. Well, then the young people come in and they've learned it from their parents and they're learning it from their professors. We want that vision too. But of course, the adults have made all those compromises, you know, just to get by, maybe to make enough money to send their children to college to get learning of how to be left. And so the young people, they think we believe in the same ends, but we know how to make it happen. We're going to take action for it. So they become more radical. That was the move to progressive, and then later to woke. And then how do the liberals react to that? They have nothing to say. They know they've been preaching these ideas and ideals, and now the students want to make them happen. And they know they never did make them happen because they've made all these compromises. So you see, that's why it's terrifying. I mean, it's so upsetting when the liberals confront a sharper, more radical version of what they themselves have been preaching. And Courtney Smith confronted that in his very office. Now they held him prisoner. But what really gave the heart attack was this. He had been a liberal. He had been in favor of civil rights. He was a Quaker, peaceful demonstrations. And all of a sudden, he saw in his office, holding him prisoner, the antithesis of that. His whole meaning in life was being destroyed before his very eyes. No wonder he had a heart attack. Now, in what I call the American student wars of the late 60s, there were casualties, like the students killed at Kent State, same day, some students killed at Jackson State in Mississippi by that National Guard. There were people injured. There were actual officials who were hurt badly. At Harvard, for example, the dean of the arts and sciences, when the students violently occupied the Harvard administration building, University Hall, they carried out on their shoulders this dean. And later not at that time, later he had a heart attack, but he survived. The only university official to die in the American student wars was Courtney Smith. And he was, in a way, represented the most dramatic contrast with his beliefs, and then the children, so to speak, brought into being.
I think we should probably wrap it up on this note and save the discussion of the Weimar Republic and so forth for another episode, if that's all right with you.
I'll just make the one comparison. The universities in Germany from the late 19th century through the Wilhelmine Empire, through the Weimar Republic, the universities were dominated by conservatives, by nationalists who believed in the class system, the estate system, in law and order. And the universities were opposed to the radicals, even the liberals. And the parents, because it took a lot of money to go to a university in those days, the parents were conservative. They raised their children to defend conservative values. They criticized the liberal or even progressive values of the Weimar Republic and the Social Democratic Party. So the students had been raised by their parents, and they were taught by their professors conservative values. But the Weimar Republic was so ineffective, it could accomplish nothing, and especially the left was so ineffective, and even the conservatives were ineffective. There was something called the Nationalist Party or the German Party. These were conservative parties that were ineffective. And so then when the National Socialist Party came along and said, we share these values, but we're going to do something about it. That's why the students and the junior faculty made the universities the very first German institution to go over to the Nazis.
All right. On that chilling note, I think we'll wrap this up. Tugboat Captain's going to have to wait for the answer to his next question about your next book. Maybe we'll do that in another episode sometime. I want to thank you very much for an absolutely fantastic analysis of the sides of the die, the who, the ways, the why, the when, the comparisons and the historical relevancy of what's going on today. And we'll stay tuned as this develops, if your prediction comes true. This is just the beginning, and there's more to come. And I hope you'll be available to analyze it for us. So thank you very much. And we'll see you in our next episode. Good night.